Hey guys, welcome back to another painting video. Today I will show you how you can paint your Pan Oceania Kestrel forces from Operation Sandtrap in vibrant blues and yellows, similar to the box art, but in less than 2 hours per model. Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching PHLANSMINIATURES. As you probably know, the Sandtrap box comes with 2 factions, and if you're interested in the Japanese side, I already have a speed painting video about that, so check it out. And of course, both the GSA and the Pan O sides also have a PDF painting guide on my Patreon with a ton of pictures, explanations, and the list of every single paint I used, so if you want to follow along even easier, give that a look as well. Just so we are on the same page, this will be a speed painting video. I will try to get as close to the box art as possible, but I will spend less than 2 hours per model, a total of roughly 13 hours for the 7 minis, so we can have these troops on the table as soon as possible. But nothing is stopping you from spending more time on some of these steps for a better result, or skipping a couple of highlighting steps if you want to go faster instead. Alright, without further ado, let's slap some paint on these guys. First of all, we are shooting for some vibrant blues and yellows with this color scheme, so my advice is to start from a very bright undercoat. You can either prime the models white or do what I did and apply a heavy zenithal highlight over a black primer. This will allow us to get easier coverage with our main colors and achieve a super saturated vibrant look, but nothing in life is free, and as you will see, we will have to pay for this one later on as well. But ultimately it's gonna be worth it. Now we are ready to start painting some actual colors, and instead of starting with the main ones on the armor, I suggest painting some pants and undergarments first. The reason for this is that these are some of the deepest elements on the models, meaning that you have to reach past the armor and leather bits to paint these. If you painted them later, we would likely mess up the more important bits. Since everything is base coated with white, coverage is quite easy, but the downside is that if we miss something, it will show up as a white dot, which will be super obvious even from afar. If we painted over black and left something out, it would be black and hard to see, or it might just look like a shadow. So one of the prices we have to pay for the vibrancy and easy coverage is that we have to be way more meticulous with our base coating. Now that we took care of the deeper parts, we can concentrate on the easier to reach bits, so we can paint the signature blue armor. There is quite a bit of this, and even over the white we need 2-3 coats for full coverage, so there is plenty of surface to paint, but the good news is that we don't need to be super precise. If I painted this over black, I would try to keep the recesses black and only hit the actual panels blue, but since now I have to cover all the white, I can just slop the blue on the whole surface. We will have to pay the price for this later too, but for now this makes my life easier, so painting all the blue on the 7 models took me around 1 hour and 20 minutes. The second biggest surface on the models after the blue is probably all the leather. I'm always surprised how many straps, pouches and weapon holsters the designers can fit on these guys. But in this case we also have 3 models with full leather jackets and leather caps, so there is even more of this material to paint. The other defining color of this color scheme beside the blue is the yellow, but since this is only the base coat, I went with a nice vibrant orange color instead of straight yellow. This will be a nice shadow color, and it will make the yellows much more vibrant and interesting later on. Based on the box art, I painted this on some of the pipes and straps, and on one of the models on a huge hood that covers most of his upper body. Even over a white undercoat, this requires quite a few layers, so don't be afraid to paint a lot of coats until you get full coverage. Then everything that was meant to be black or metallic, I simply painted with black paint. This included mostly the guns and some decorative metal elements all around the models. Finally, I had to take care of some of the white panels. These are also recessed and harder to reach, but I wanted to take care of them now instead of in the beginning, since I knew I would mess them up anyway while painting something else, so it's more efficient to simply leave them to the end. As usual, I used silver grey instead of pure white for this, and in addition to the armor panels, I also painted the rocket thrusters on some of the models, plus some of the details that I wanted to be red later on, like the eyes and the recessed circular bits on the arms and legs. And now that we have everything base coated, it's time to pay the price for that bright undercoat. Since all the recesses are the same color as the panels around them, the models look like undefined blobs of color, so we need to shade them somehow. Instead of using a traditional shade paint that would be hard to control and would also darken down and mess up all the nicely painted and coated panels, I advise to do a controlled recess shading step. I thin down some black paint slightly and use the sharp brush to paint it between every panel and into every recess. The goal here is to separate panels and have a black line everywhere where 2 of them meet. At the end, this will make the models way more defined and easier to read. No need to be super careful with this. Later on in the highlighting phase we can correct mistakes and refine lines, but of course you can put in more time if you want to have a more refined result than mine. For reference, it took me around 45 minutes to do this step for all the models, and at this point I had put in around 4 hours of work into this project overall. Before I moved on to the highlighting phase, there was one more thing I had to take care of. I needed to do something about the bases. So I took some asphalt diorama texture and spread it on the bases around the feet of the models, trying not to get too much on the actual feet, but covering everything else fully and more or less evenly. Alright, so far so good, all the colors are on the models, I managed to cover all the white, and I even paid the ferryman for using the white undercoat. Now it's time for the highlighting stage. And just like with the base coats, I started with the undergarments and pants, but I ran into a little problem. I couldn't find a specific paint in my collection that would work as a good highlight color for the dark sea blue over the white. So I took some ice yellow and mixed in about 30% into the original base coat color and used this to highlight. I promised to use specific colors for all the rest of the highlights, but I had to come up with a MacGyver solution for this one. As you can see, I used this to mark all the edges and to paint the raised surfaces, but I also added some tiny scratches on the larger bits to make them a little more interesting and to fake a transition without putting too much effort into blending and smoothing things. This is probably the least interesting material on these models, which kinda just blends into the background, so I decided that a single highlight will be enough. Then, since the white armor panels are deeper than the blue ones, I decided to do those next before tackling the actual blue armor. First of all, I needed a little bit of shading on them, so because I had just used it, I thinned down some dark sea blue and glazed it over the white. I did it quite roughly and fast, dragging it from where I wanted the panels to be light towards the shadow areas that I wanted to be darker. I did 2 or 3 passes on the bigger panels and a single one on the smaller ones. And now that I messed the white panels up, I could go back with off-white and highlight them up again. As usual, I painted the edges, did some scratches on the larger surfaces, and where it was too rough, I thinned it down a little and glazed it over the scratches towards where I wanted the lighter area to be. Now it was time for the biggest and most important element on these ladies and gents, highlighting the blue armor. First of all, I used Ducat blue and I painted all the edges, covered the parts that were facing the light the most, meaning that they were panels facing up, and established a rough transition on the borders of the highlights with some scratches. This process is the longest in the entire project. It took me roughly 1.5 hours to complete this on the 7 models. But you can spend a lot more time to make the highlights smoother and more refined for a better end result, or you can opt to just do the edge highlights and skip the volumetric ones for a much faster overall paint job. Once I was done with this, I switched to a brighter color, deep sky blue, and I did the exact same thing again, but only inside the previous highlights, covering around half of their surface with this lighter color. I concentrated these highlights onto the edges and panels which would be facing the light the most. This took me about 1 hour for the 7 models, so about 2/3 of the time it took to do the first highlight. Finally, I did it all over again with an even brighter version of the same tone, but now I mostly concentrated on doing edge highlights on the most prominent edges and only a tiny bit of highlighting on the surfaces most hit by the light. For the first 2 sets of edge highlights, I didn't try to be super precise and thin, but for these you should try to go as thin as possible. This final step took me another 25 minutes or so, and overall highlighting the blue armor took around 3 hours for the 7 models, which is a nice big chunk of time. But after sweating over all those blue highlights, let's do something easy, fast, but high impact. Let's do the reddish-orange lights. Remember that originally we base coated those with the same silver grey that we also used for the white panels. Now I took some blood scarlet ink and simply dropped it into those recesses, covering all of the grey. Since this is an ink, it flows into there without much effort. I just had to make sure that it doesn't overflow. Wherever I went a little overboard, I used the blue highlight colors to correct the edge of the recesses. Now I took some pure white and dropped it right in the middle of those red circles, covering the middle but making sure to leave enough of the red around the rim. If the red area was too small, I didn't press the issue, risking to cover everything with the white. I simply left it red. At this point, all I had to do was to take some orange fluorescent ink and drop it into the holes, covering both the red on the rim and the white in the middle. And the result when it dries looks like a reddish orange light with a hot orange part in the middle, essentially a pretty cool but quite basic glow effect. Okay, let's do the leather bits next. I did these in a quite similar fashion to the blues with a little twist at the end. First, I highlighted everything with green-brown with my usual sketchy method of painting all the edges, doing little scratches everywhere and covering the surfaces that are pointing up towards the light more than the ones facing away from it. Then I switched to a more yellowish tone with the final highlight using this flesh tone. And with this I did the same thing again, but I also used some glazes of this same color on the larger surfaces to smooth them out, dragging them from the midtones towards the highlights. Now for the twist. I took some sepia ink and thinned it down a little on the wet palette with a little water. I painted this over everything, but by dragging it from the highlights and ending my brush stroke in the shadows. This darkens everything down a tad, smooths things out and creates a more glossy leather-like finish. Okay, now it's time to add some color onto these guys by finishing the yellow parts. Using volcanic yellow, I covered around 80-90% of the orange I had painted before, concentrating on the raised parts and leaving the original color in the recesses and the shadows. This needs 3-4 coats to cover fully, and by slightly reducing the size of the area we cover with every subsequent layer, it's pretty easy to get a relatively smooth transition. Then I switched to a super vibrant bright yellow color and I did the same thing, but as usual, now only inside the area I covered with the previous color, but keeping some of it visible at the borders. I also made sure to highlight all the edges with this one. Finally, I had to do all the metal bits. Unfortunately for us, on the box art these look more like highlighted black than true non-metallic metal, so we don't have to put a crazy amount of effort into making it look good. First, I covered around 80% of the black with anthracite grey, leaving the original black in the recessed areas and in the shadows. Then with French blue, I did the same thing, but now only working inside the anthracite grey highlights. I also highlighted all the edges with this color. Going even further up in brightness, I used as medium gray, but this time I only highlighted the edges that were facing up, and I also tried to make the edge highlights as thin as possible. And finally, with white, I only painted some of the most prominent edges and corners. I felt that the end result was a little too bright for the highlighted black, so I thinned down some black paint quite heavily, and I washed this over the weapons and also onto the white rocket thrusters on the backpacks. This smooths out the highlights on the weapons and integrates them together, and on the thrusters it provides a rough weathering effect, making it look like soot from the exhaust has accumulated there. Now I only had the bases to finish before calling these guys done. So I took some dark brown and I overbrushed this on the bases, leaving only a little of the original black in the deepest parts. Then I used an old brush to spread orange earth ground texture over mostly the middle part of the base, covering around 60% of the surface but leaving quite a bit of the brown visible around it. I finished the effect with some light oxide rust. I spread this much brighter rust color inside the previous one kinda randomly, covering around 50% of it. And with that, after 13 hours of painting, my Kestrel force was ready to take on the GSA on the battlefield, and the end result looks like this. Let me know which bunch you like more, the Pan O Boys in blue or the GSA Cyber Samurai. With that, we reached the end of this tutorial. I hope you guys found it useful. If you use it to paint your own models, I would love to see them, so don't hesitate to tag me on Instagram if you post them. And before I sign off, I wanted to thank my Patreon members for their support. They are the ones that make this channel possible, especially the ones in the captain level. Thank you guys, see you in the next one.